The rancher saw his horse staring at the fence every night for 3 weeks before. He finally grabbed a shovel and dug where the animal wouldn't stop looking. Arthur Morgan's hands trembled as dirt gave way to something that shouldn't have been. There, bone, white against the dark Wyoming earth. Then beadwork. Intricate patterns that caught the morning sun like scattered prayers. Dutch, his prized stallion, stood behind him with ears pinned forward. The horse had been coming to this exact spot along the fence line every evening, standing motionless until dawn. Arthur had dismissed it as odd behavior. Animals did strange things sometimes. But the digging revealed why Dutch couldn't look away. "There's more than one body down here, Mr. Morgan." Ellis knelt beside the shallow grave, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur's ranch hand had joined him at sunrise, both men finally surrendering to the mystery that had plagued them for weeks. More bones emerged as Ellis brushed away centuries of accumulated soil. Small bones. A child's skull adorned with delicate beadwork that spoke of careful hands and loving preparation. Arthur's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He'd bought this land from Dutch van der Linde 6 months ago. Clean territory, Dutch had promised. No complications. No history that would follow a man trying to build an honest life after years of running from his past. "You should have told me about your dreams," Arthur said, his voice strained with something between anger and hurt. Ellis had confessed moments earlier, 3 weeks of nightmares. Visions of this exact spot. Children's voices carried on the wind. He'd feared speaking up, worried Arthur might think him touched in the head. The admission created a wedge between them that hadn't existed before. "And say what? That I was dreaming about dead folks I ain't never seen?" The hurt in Ellis's voice was genuine. Arthur had hired him not just for his skill with cattle, but because Ellis was the only man who'd looked past Arthur's reputation. Trust had been the foundation of their partnership. Now that foundation felt cracked. The sound of approaching horses cut through their argument. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs as he grabbed his shovel and began covering the remains. Whoever had buried these bodies might have been watching, waiting to see if they'd ever surface. Dutch van der Linde appeared over the rise with his associate Micah Bell flanking him. Both men sat their horses with the casual confidence of those accustomed to being welcomed wherever they rode. But their timing felt too deliberate, too convenient. "Everything settling in well, Arthur?" Dutch asked, his smile warm but his eyes cold as Winter Creek water. Arthur forced normalcy into his voice. "Just fine, Dutch. Land's been good to us." But he noticed how Dutch's gaze swept the area where they'd hastily smoothed the disturbed earth, how Micah's attention lingered on the fence line with something that looked like recognition. "Fixing fence posts," Arthur added, lifting his shovel as explanation for the disturbed ground. "Good man. Infrastructure's everything in this business." Dutch's horse shifted beneath him, but the man's attention never wavered from Arthur's face. "You let me know if you need anything. Anything at all." As the two men rode away, Arthur caught Micah glancing back at the fence line. The look wasn't curious, it was knowing. "They suspect something," Ellis said once the riders had disappeared over the ridge. Arthur nodded. The visit had been reconnaissance, testing to see if Arthur and Ellis had discovered what lay beneath their property. The question now was whether Dutch van der Linde had simply known about the bodies, or if he'd been the one to put them there. That evening, Arthur faced the hardest decision of his life since leaving his outlaw days behind. The bodies represented people. A family based on the beadwork and the way the remains had been arranged. They deserved justice. But reporting them meant involving territorial authorities who were notoriously corrupt. Arthur could lose everything: his ranch, his chance at an honest life, his future. "These people deserve justice," Ellis said quietly as they stood over the covered grave. "And we deserve to live," Arthur replied, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. The moral weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. Staying silent made him complicit in covering up what appeared to be murder. But speaking up could destroy the life he'd fought so hard to build. As darkness fell, strange things began happening around the ranch. Cattle refused to graze near the fence line, clustering together in the far pasture despite better grass being available closer to the house. Arthur's tools, carefully arranged in the barn each evening, were found scattered across the yard come morning. Ellis reported hearing children's voices carried on the night wind, though no children lived within. 20 miles of the ranch. Dutch the horse continued his nightly vigil, standing motionless by the fence until dawn. But now other animals joined him. Barn cats that usually hunted mice gathered in a semicircle around the burial site. Even the chickens avoided the area, their usual pecking and scratching patterns forming a deliberate circle around the spot where the bodies lay. The supernatural activity confirmed what Arthur had begun to suspect. They couldn't simply rebury the bodies and pretend nothing had happened. Whatever had occurred here demanded acknowledgement. The dead wouldn't rest quietly in unmarked graves. Arthur made his decision as the sun rose on another day of his horse's strange behavior. They needed to understand what they were dealing with before they could decide how to proceed. He couldn't report something he didn't fully comprehend, and he couldn't live with the growing certainty that his land had been built on someone else's grave. "We're going to town," he told Ellis over breakfast. "Time to find out who these people were and how they ended up buried on my property." Ellis nodded, relief evident in his features. The supernatural occurrences had been wearing on both men. But Ellis bore the heavier burden. His dreams had become more vivid each night, filled with images of the family that had been buried beneath their feet. Arthur saddled his horse and prepared for the ride to Valentine. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But as he swung into the saddle, he couldn't shake the feeling that learning the truth would cost him everything he'd worked to build. The schoolhouse in Valentine stood like a weathered prayer against the endless sky. Sadie Adler looked up from her desk as Arthur and Ellis entered, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light that streamed through cracked windows. Maps covered every available wall surface. Documents stacked in careful piles spoke of meticulous record keeping that the territorial government had long since abandoned. "I keep track of who belongs where," she said without preamble. "Someone has to remember the people who disappear." Arthur removed his hat. The gesture felt inadequate against the weight of what they'd come to ask. Ellis stood silent beside him, his usual ease replaced by something more fragile. The dreams had been getting worse. Sadie's finger traced a path across her largest map. Rivers and settlements marked in careful ink. Names written in margins that official documents would never acknowledge. The Wapiti family. Chief Rain's Fall. His wife and their 3 children. She pulled a photograph from her desk drawer. 5 faces stared back at them with quiet dignity. The father's eyes held kindness that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. The mother's dress bore the same intricate beadwork they'd found in the grave. 3 children arranged between their parents, their faces bright with hope that would never see fulfillment. They disappeared 2 years ago while traveling to the reservation. Official report said they moved on to join relatives in the north. Arthur studied the photograph. The youngest child couldn't have been more than 7. The oldest perhaps 12. Children who should have grown up to carry forward their family's traditions. "But you didn't believe it," Ellis said quietly. "I never believe it when whole families vanish without a trace. Not in this territory." The unspoken truth hung between them. This was land where inconvenient people disappeared regularly, where official reports covered more than they revealed, where questions went unanswered because the wrong people held the power to answer them. That evening, back at the ranch, the supernatural activity escalated beyond what either man could rationalize away. Dutch the horse led them to 3 more burial sites across the property, each one marked by disturbed earth that hadn't been visible in daylight. The stallion would stop at each location, paw the ground twice, then move to the next. Ellis dropped to his knees beside the third site. His breathing had become shallow, his eyes unfocused in the way that meant the visions were coming. They're trying to tell us something. This isn't about haunting us. They want their story told. Arthur's practical mind fought against what he was witnessing. Dead folks were dead. They didn't lead horses to burial sites or whisper names on the wind. But the evidence surrounded him. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since sunset. Frost formed on grass that should have been warm from the day's sun. There's a pattern here, Ellis continued, his voice distant. These aren't random graves. They're arranged in a circle around something. The wind picked up, carrying voices that sounded almost like children playing. Arthur's skin crawled with the impossibility of it all. But Dutch's behavior couldn't be explained away. Neither could the way other animals avoided certain areas of the property. Over the following days, Arthur and Ellis made regular trips to Valentine. Sadie introduced them to other teachers, missionaries, and traders who worked with the native population. A picture emerged that chilled Arthur more than any supernatural occurrence. Dutch van der Linde hadn't just bought Arthur's land. He'd been systematically acquiring native territory throughout the region. Families would be approached with offers to buy their ancestral lands. Those who refused would disappear. Their property would be declared abandoned and sold at territorial auctions. He's got connections with the territorial marshal, Sadie explained during one of their visits. Anyone who asks too many questions gets transferred to remote posts or finds themselves facing trumped-up charges. Arthur felt the walls closing in around him. This wasn't just about one buried family. It was about a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. And somehow, he'd been chosen to be the unwitting caretaker of the evidence. The visits from Dutch van der Linde became more frequent, more pointed. The man's facade of friendly concern grew thinner with each appearance. Micah Bell took to writing the property boundaries, ostensibly checking fence lines, but clearly watching for signs of discovery. "You seem troubled lately, Arthur," Dutch observed during one evening visit. "Not having second thoughts about ranch life, are you? Just the usual worries, making ends meet, keeping the cattle healthy." But Dutch's eyes had grown cold as winter stone. "Micah mentioned you've been digging around the property. Foundation work? Fixing fence posts. Grounds. Then settling funny in places." The lie came easily, but Arthur could see Dutch wasn't buying it. The man's attention kept drifting to the spots where they'd found the graves, as if he knew exactly where to look. After Dutch and Micah rode away, Ellis shook his head. "They know we found something. We're running out of time." That night, Arthur experienced his first vision. Chief Rain's fall appeared in his dreams, not as a threatening specter, but as a father desperate for justice. The spirit showed him flashes of that horrible night 2 years ago, armed men surrounding the family's camp. Dutch van der Linde's voice giving orders that Arthur's mind refused to process clearly. But one detail remained crystal clear when he woke. His property hadn't just been the burial site. It had been where the family was murdered. The next morning brought a visitor Arthur hadn't expected. John Marston sat his horse at the property line, had pulled low over eyes that held the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much. His clothes were worn, his horse lathered from hard riding, but there was something determined in his posture. "I heard you've been asking questions about the Wapiti family," John said without preamble. Arthur nodded, studying the stranger's face. There was truth there, and pain, and the kind of fear that came from carrying dangerous knowledge. "I saw everything," John continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was camped about a mile south when it happened." Dutch van der Linde and his men surrounded their camp just after midnight. The words hit Arthur like physical blows. Each detail John shared painted a picture of calculated murder. The family had refused to sell their ancestral burial ground. Dutch had discovered valuable mineral deposits beneath the sacred site. What followed had been brutal and efficient. They wanted the land for what was underneath it. Something about silver deposits and mineral rights. Arthur's stomach churned. Why didn't you report it? To who? The territorial marshals in Dutch's pocket. Half the officials in this territory owe him money or favors or both. John's hands shook as he continued. Dutch sold you this land on purpose. Said he needed a respectable owner who wouldn't ask questions. Someone with enough of a questionable past to keep quiet if things got complicated. The revelation transformed Arthur's understanding of everything that had happened. He wasn't just an innocent buyer who'd stumbled onto a crime scene. He'd been specifically chosen to be the unwitting guardian of Dutch van der Linde's secret. His reputation as a former outlaw had made him the perfect candidate for intimidation and manipulation. He used me, Arthur said, the words tasting bitter. Used my past to cover his tracks. Ellis placed a weathered hand on Arthur's shoulder. You didn't know, but now you do. Question is, what are you going to do about it? That night, Arthur made his decision. The guilt over being manipulated transformed into something harder and more focused. Justice, not just for the Wapiti family, but for every family that had disappeared into Dutch van der Linde's web of corruption. The supernatural activity seemed to respond to his resolve. Chief Rain's false spirit appeared more clearly, showing Arthur hidden locations where evidence might be found. Personal items from the family that Dutch's men had buried separately. Documents that might prove the conspiracy. But as Arthur prepared to gather that evidence, he noticed riders watching his property from distant ridges. Dutch van der Linde's patience was running out. The trap was closing around them, and Arthur realized they were running out of time to spring their own. The evidence spread across Sadie's schoolhouse desk told a story written in blood and buried dreams. Arthur traced his finger along the map they'd created, marking locations where families had vanished and Dutch van der Linde's holdings had mysteriously expanded. Red pins for the disappeared, black pins for the acquired land. The pattern emerged. Stark and undeniable. John Marston sat hunched over testimony he'd written in careful script. His hands shook slightly as he described that night 2 years ago. The fear hadn't left him, but something harder had grown alongside it. A weariness of running from truth that demanded to be spoken. I counted 8 other families in the past 3 years, Sadie said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were uncovering. All refused to sell. All disappeared without official investigation. Ellis knelt beside a collection of personal items they'd recovered from the burial sites. A child's beaded bracelet. A medicine pouch blessed by tribal elders. A silver locket containing a photograph of grandparents who would never see their grandchildren grow up. Each artifact had been found exactly where Chief Rain's false spirit had indicated during Arthur's increasingly vivid dreams. The supernatural communications had become more direct as their investigation deepened. Ellis would enter a trance state, his voice changing timbre as the spirit spoke through him. The messages weren't threats or demands for vengeance. They were pleas for remembrance, for justice, for the simple acknowledgement that these people had existed and mattered. They're not angry, Ellis explained after one particularly intense session. They're tired. Tired of being forgotten. Arthur found himself talking to the spirits during his evening rounds, something his practical mind still struggled to accept. But the conversations felt necessary, sacred, even. A promise made to the wind that carried their voices. I'm going to make this right, he whispered to the empty air above the graves. I swear it. The weight of that promise settled into his bones. This wasn't just about clearing his conscience or reclaiming his land. It was about honoring the dead and preventing future murders. The responsibility felt heavier than anything he'd carried during his outlaw days. Dutch van der Linde's visits became a study in barely contained menace. His smile grew thinner with each appearance, his questions more pointed. The facade of friendly concern cracked like drought-baked earth. "You seem troubled lately, Arthur," Dutch observed during one evening encounter. "Spending a lot of time in town. Not losing faith in ranch life, are you? Just handling business. Supplies and such." But Dutch's eyes had gone cold as winter. "Stone, Micah mentioned you've been asking questions about local history. Curious about your neighbors?" Arthur's throat tightened. Man likes to know about the land he's working. Indeed. Though some history is better left buried. The threat hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. When Dutch and Micah rode away, Arthur noticed how they took the long route around. The property boundaries, surveying, planning, preparing for something that made Arthur's skin crawl with anticipation. "They know we found something," Ellis said once the riders had disappeared. "Question is, how long before they decide to do something about it?" That night brought the answer. Arthur woke to find Sadie Adler standing in his kitchen, tears streaming down her face and a revolver trembling in her hands. The weapon wasn't pointed at him, but her presence in his home after midnight sent ice through his veins. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Arthur had trusted her, relied on her knowledge and connections, built their entire case around information she'd provided. Now she stood in his kitchen with guilt written across her features and a gun that suggested things had moved beyond apologies. "He said he'd tell me what really happened to my husband if I kept an eye on you," she continued. "My husband disappeared 3 years ago. Dutch promised answers if I reported on your activities." Ellis appeared in the doorway, his own weapon drawn but not aimed. The standoff felt fragile as spun glass. One wrong word could shatter everything they'd built. "But I can't do this anymore," Sadie said, lowering her revolver. "Not after seeing what he's done to those families. Not after meeting you and knowing you're trying to do the right thing." Arthur studied her face in the lamplight. The tears were real. So was the self-loathing that twisted her features. She'd been caught between Dutch's manipulation and her own conscience, and the battle had finally reached its conclusion. "He's coming for you tonight," she said. "Plans to stage an accident at the ranch. Make it look like you and Ellis had a falling out. Or maybe bandits attacked. Something that leaves you both dead and the land available for reclaim." The words confirmed Arthur's worst fears. Dutch van der Linde had run out of patience for subtle threats and manipulation. Direct action was the only option left. "But I sent word to John Marston before I came here," Sadie added. "Told him to bring help. Federal marshals if he could find them." Arthur felt a flicker of hope pierce through the dread. If John had reached the right people, if federal authorities could arrive in time, they might have a chance to expose Dutch's network before it buried them along with the truth. The sound of approaching horses killed that hope. Too many riders. Too well organized. Dutch had brought enough men to overwhelm any resistance Arthur and Ellis might offer. "Get to the barn," Arthur told Sadie. "Stay hidden no matter what happens." She nodded and slipped out the back door. Arthur and Ellis checked their weapons and prepared for what might be their final stand. The evidence of Dutch's crimes was hidden in the schoolhouse, but that wouldn't matter if they didn't survive to present it. Dutch van der Linde appeared in the doorway without knocking. His mask of civility had finally dropped completely, revealing the calculating killer beneath. Micah Bell flanked him, along with 4 other men Arthur didn't recognize. Professional guns, by the look of them. "You should have minded your own business, Arthur," Dutch said, his voice carrying disappointment that felt genuine. "I gave you a chance at a clean life, and you threw it away for the sake of dead people who can't thank you." "Clean?" Arthur's voice carried all the disgust he felt. "You built it on the graves of children." Dutch's face hardened. "I built it on opportunity. This territory needs strong leadership, not sentiment about people who were never going to adapt to progress." The casual racism in his words hit Arthur like a physical blow. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about a man who saw entire cultures as obstacles to his vision of the future. "You're going to deed this land back to me," Dutch continued, producing legal documents from his coat. "Sign it over willingly, and I'll make your deaths quick. Refuse, and Ellis dies slowly while you watch." Arthur looked at Ellis, seeing his own resolve reflected in his friend's eyes. They'd come too far to surrender now. The truth was bigger than their individual lives. "No," Arthur said simply. Dutch's smile turned predatory. "Then we do this. The hard way." The temperature in the room plummeted as Dutch spoke. Frost began forming on the windows despite the warm evening. The oil lamps flickered as an impossible wind stirred through the closed space. Dutch's men shifted nervously, their confidence shaken by phenomena they couldn't explain. Arthur felt the presence of the Wapiti family gathering around them, drawn by the proximity of their killer and the promise of justice finally being served. "What is this?" Micah's voice cracked with fear as his breath began misting in the suddenly frigid air. "Justice," Ellis said quietly, his eyes reflecting an otherworldly light. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Arthur realized the dead had no intention of letting their murderer escape a second time. The supernatural presence filled the room like water rushing into a sinking ship. Dutch's men stumbled backward as their breath misted in air that had turned arctic. Tools rattled against the walls without human touch. The oil lamps flickered in rhythm with something that might have been a heartbeat. Arthur felt the weight of invisible eyes upon him. Not malevolent, expectant. The Wapiti family had gathered to witness justice finally being served to their killer. "I won't be part of covering this up anymore," Arthur declared, his voice cutting through the otherworldly cold. "These people deserve justice, and I'm going to see they get it." Dutch's face contorted with rage that had been building for months. "You self-righteous fool. You think anyone will believe your word over mine? They won't have to believe just my word." "John." Marston appeared in the doorway behind Dutch's men, flanked by two federal marshals whose badges caught the lamplight. The timing was perfect. The trap Dutch had set had become his own cage. The supernatural activity reached its crescendo as the truth was finally spoken aloud in the presence of its architect. The temperature plummeted further. Windows cracked from the sudden cold. Dutch's horses outside whinnied in terror, their panic adding to the chaos. "Federal marshals," the older lawman announced, his voice steady despite the impossible phenomena surrounding them. "We have warrants for the arrest of Dutch van der Linde and his associates on charges of murder and conspiracy." Dutch's men looked to their leader for guidance but found only a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The supernatural manifestations had shattered their confidence. These were men who could face bullets and blade, but not the weight of murdered souls demanding recognition. Arthur pulled the carefully gathered evidence from beneath his floorboards. Documents, testimonies, personal effects that told the story of systematic murder disguised as land acquisition. The case they'd built was solid enough to withstand any legal challenge Dutch might mount. "You have honored our family," a voice seemed to whisper through Ellis, though his lips barely moved. "Their spirits can rest now." The federal marshals moved with professional efficiency. Handcuffs clicked into place. Rights were read. The network of corruption that had seemed untouchable revealed its fragility when exposed to federal scrutiny. Dutch, in his final moment of defeat, turned his venom on Arthur. "You've destroyed everything for what? People who were never going to matter in the grand scheme of progress." "For the truth," Arthur replied quietly. "Something you forgot the value of long ago." The words carried finality. Dutch van der Linde was led away in chains, his empire of stolen land and murdered families finally exposed to the light he'd fought so hard to keep buried. As the last of Dutch's men disappeared into federal custody, the supernatural presence began to fade. The temperature returned to normal, the impossible wind stilled. Arthur felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that had been there since the first night he'd watched his horse stare at the fence. Chief Rain's fall appeared one final time, visible only to Arthur. The spirit's face held peace instead of pain, gratitude instead of accusation. He nodded once, a gesture that spoke volumes about forgiveness and the power of truth to heal old wounds. Then he faded away, taking with him the restless energy that had haunted the land for 2 years. Ellis breathed deeply for the first time in weeks. They're at peace now, I can feel it. The absence of the supernatural presence left an emptiness that felt clean rather than hollow. The land could heal now. The dead could rest. The living could move forward without the weight of hidden atrocities pressing down upon them. Arthur lost his ranch to legal complications and federal seizure, but gained something more valuable. The knowledge that he'd stood up for justice when it mattered most, that he'd chosen truth over comfort, that his past as an outlaw had been redeemed by his present as a man of conscience. I thought I needed this land to prove I'd changed, he told Ellis as they packed their belongings. Turns out I needed to lose it to prove that instead. Sadie, freed from Dutch's blackmail and forgiven for her forced betrayal, helped them find new property. Clean land with no secrets buried beneath it, no ghosts demanding justice. Just earth and sky and the promise of honest work. The surviving members of the Wapiti tribe arrived 3 days later. Chief Rain's Fall's brother conducted proper burial rites for the family, their remains finally receiving the respect and ceremony they deserved. Arthur stood witness as prayers were offered, in a language he didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. You gave them their voices back, the chief's brother told Arthurward. In our tradition, that is the greatest gift one can give the dead. Arthur Ellis and John Marston established their new ranch together. 3 men bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. The land they chose had been legitimately purchased from willing sellers. No blood in the soil. No secrets in the shadows. Arthur's horse, renamed Justice at Ellis's suggestion, grazed peacefully in fields where wildflowers grew instead of unmarked graves. The animal's behavior had returned to normal, no longer compelled by supernatural forces to stand vigil over. Buried in justice. The memorial service for the Wapiti family drew people from across the territory, tribal leaders, federal officials, ordinary citizens who'd never known the family, but understood the importance of bearing witness to their story. A small monument was erected, ensuring their names would never be forgotten again. Arthur stood before the gathered crowd, hat in hand, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. In the end, he spoke simply about the power of truth to heal old wounds and the responsibility of the living to honor the dead. The sunset that evening painted the sky in shades of gold and purple. Arthur and Ellis worked together to mend fence on their new property, their movements synchronized by months of shared labor and mutual trust. The work felt different now. Clean, purposeful, strange. How losing everything can feel like gaining what matters most, Ellis observed as they secured the final post. Arthur nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for elaboration. Redemption hadn't come from forgetting his past, but from using it to guide better choices in the present. The outlaw who'd once taken what he wanted had become a man willing to sacrifice everything for justice. As darkness fell, Arthur made his final rounds of the new property. No supernatural presence troubled the night. No voices whispered on the wind, just the peaceful sounds of cattle settling for sleep and the distant call of night birds. He paused at the fence line, remembering his old horse's nightly vigil. The memory no longer carried dread but gratitude. Sometimes the dead spoke through the living world, demanding justice that only the living could provide. Sometimes truth surfaced through the most unexpected messengers. Arthur walked back to the house where Ellis waited with coffee and the comfortable Silence of men who'd faced darkness together and emerged into light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight brought peace earned through sacrifice and courage. The land stretched out before them, clean and full of promise. No secrets buried beneath. No ghosts demanding justice. Just earth and sky and the quiet satisfaction of men who'd chosen to do right when doing wrong would have been easier. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.